Love, rage, and solidarity. Welcome to the first episode of the Green Anti-Capitalist Front that's Lockdown, our regular discussion where we educate ourselves for the struggle while the virus goes on. Because as the state and capital transform themselves to survive the virus and exert their authoritarian control over our planet, so much we adapt to fight them. Today, in the first episode, we're going to be discussing the topic of disaster capitalism with one of the collaborators of the Green Anti-Capitalist Front, and we'll have a live chat of people with us joining to discuss it as well. And we'll also follow us today's discussion with a reading group that will be happening later this month. So be on the lookout for that. Without much further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Jay, who's going to be introducing today's topic, and let him take over. Go ahead.
Hello. So for the purposes of this live stream, you can call me Jay. I'm doing this live stream because a lot of my uni life was basically spent studying and writing about disaster capitalism. And so obviously as the Green Anti-Capitalist Front and with what's going on right now, it seemed really relevant. I think we should start off by just kind of going into what disaster capitalism is. It first got majorly popularized as a term by Naomi Klein's 2007 book, The Shock Doctrine. And so that's what kind of really brought disaster capitalism into the mainstream. And it's basically an explanation of how capital takes advantage and in some cases even causes and exacerbates disasters to channel wealth from bottom to top, public to private, while also changing the environment to be more capitalism friendly. And by environment, I don't sort of mean physical environment necessarily, although that does come into it, but also kind of in terms of government policy, culture, corporate regulation, even kind of philosophy and ideology even features in as well. Really key features of disaster capitalist thinking: deregulation. So that's kind of making it easier for businesses to do whatever they like. So kind of reducing things like financial regulation is a big part of disaster. Reducing regulation on safety. We can't afford to protect workers anymore because we're in the middle of a disaster, etc. Privatization is another big one. So that's essentially taking things out of public hands, moving them into private hands. Quite often things that could be taken as being the means of production that'll happen with. We've obviously seen that in the UK. We know a lot about privatization in the UK. And ultimately, it's all about a transfer of wealth and power from poor to rich and from public to private, both within and between borders. So that's a little bit of what disaster capitalism is. But what is a disaster? A disaster is not a hurricane. A hurricane isn't a disaster. A tsunami isn't a disaster. A virus isn't a disaster. A meteor isn't a disaster. A war, you could call a disaster. The lines get a little bit blurred there. It's certainly a disaster when the US drops billions of tons of ordnance on your house anyway. But it's all these things are hazards. They're not disasters necessarily. A massive tsunami the size of what we saw in 2004 striking the very well built up flood defences of Holland probably wouldn't have necessarily turned into a disaster. In Southeast Asia, it turned into a disaster which killed 200,000 people and completely changed millions and millions and millions of people's lives. And this is just one example of how disaster operates differently depending on how rich or poor you are. This is why we see in disaster kind of discourse this thing called vulnerability and resilience. A disaster happens when a vulnerability, or usually multiple vulnerabilities, come up against a hazard. The resilience isn't there to resist the hazard, and we get a disaster. This is why we're often, well, almost all the time, we see poorer areas much more affected by disasters than richer areas. Not just because of the innate things, but also rich areas do literally just get more government funding to protect specifically against disasters, as always seems to be the case. Now, this isn't just international. This doesn't just happen on an international level, like the difference between Holland and Southeast Asia. It happens within nations as well. Hurricane Katrina. Do you think the response to the 2004 hurricane would have been the same if it hadn't principally hit a poor and majority black city? No, it definitely wouldn't have been. If that had hit the Hamptons, we'd have seen a much more effective response and a much more fair response that didn't essentially result in ethnic cleansing. That's essentially what the response to the 2004 hurricane was. I'm not going to talk about that in a huge amount of detail, but there is a lot of literature out there on Katrina and disaster capitalism, which I would really recommend looking into. So it can really manifest itself in unexpected ways as well. So it's not just necessarily the poorer area didn't have the nice big wall. As an example, many areas of Southeast Asia suffered in 2004, not because they couldn't rebuild quickly or didn't know how to deal with tsunamis. They'd been dealing with tsunamis for thousands of years, but because their economy now, because of Western capitalism, relied on Western tourism and had largely supplanted the economies before capitalism kind of did its whole colonialism. That supplanted that, now relied on Western tourism. As soon as the disaster hit, no Western tourists wanted to go there anymore, so the entire local economy collapses. So we see capitalism kind of giving with one hand, taking away with the other. That's how we can very much say that capitalism is 100% colonialism. So the point of this is to show that disasters are already, before we even bring capitalism into it in a huge way, really, really political things because of the vulnerability aspect. A disaster happens more because of the vulnerability than the hazard. So COVID-19, not a disaster, it's a hazard. COVID-19 never had to turn into a disaster necessarily. The disaster is unfolding in different ways because of different vulnerabilities all over the world. So I'm going to ask for some examples of vulnerabilities you can think of in the UK specifically, and then generally for any vulnerability to COVID-19. These could be more or less related to capitalism. Throw your hand up with the hand button if you want to speak. No. So just to get started, one of the biggest ones, and one of the ones that I imagine was playing on a lot of people's minds, was NHS and social care underfunding. So as we know, for the last 10 years, the Tories have been cutting NHS funding and social care really brutally. And to be honest, New Labour wasn't even that much better. So for decades, we've now been facing underfunding of the NHS and social care. That means there's no slack in the system. We've got reliance on the private sector for next to everything. This has been seen with kind of the ventilator issue, and it means that for next to everything, profit will come before people. They will never admit that. There is no document out there saying put profit before people. That's not how this works. It's just what happens. Grossly incompetent leadership. It is a vulnerability. Our current stock of leaders are largely picked from rich posh boys who have no real reason to be there apart from who they were born as. You compare this to other countries, you look at the leadership, for example, that Jacinda Ardern has shown in New Zealand, and we see a really different story. I'm no big fan of states necessarily, but I think that it's very obvious that there was a much better leadership response in New Zealand than there was in the UK. Another thing that leaves us quite vulnerable is an atomized population. So what's been really nice actually during the COVID-19 crisis has been seeing communities coming together, seeing mutual aid networks taking off, seeing them communities kind of reform the bonds that might have been there as a given maybe 50, 60 years ago, before the 80s, before neoliberalism, free market capitalism really went into turbo drive. That's really nice to see, but they weren't originally there, and there are definitely going to be people getting missed by those groups through no fault of their own, just as a result of living in such an atomized society, a society that is so split up, where them social bonds have been so badly broken down. This is something that is a huge problem, and something that I think is one of the biggest issues in Western industrialized societies, and it's really been brought to the fore here. And then we've got things as well, which kind of links back to a bigger picture, in that I guess it's kind of the profit thing, the reliance on the private sector, that we're seeing things like construction sites of luxury properties still going, despite being very obviously non-essential, they're still going. And that is kind of because of this focus on the economy, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Now, one of the most obvious examples I can see of disaster capitalism in the UK is, and in terms of purely the funneling money from public to private and poor to rich, and making sure that the top society gets the most money out of this, is the issue with the ventilators. So you've got these small firms set up that have the exact sort of machinery that you would think you would need to build a ventilator. They have all of the stuff, checking the chat there. They have all the stuff you need to make ventilators. They have experience making ventilators. They have the sort of extremely high precision mechanical equipment that you need to make a ventilator. Great, amazing. Now they've been passed up, and I don't know if you remember, but the government actually said, we're putting all these orders, and then multiple companies came out and said, we haven't received any orders, we've received no communication, despite trying to get in touch with them. Now Dyson may well have some related expertise. They work with things that suck and blow air. That's about as far as I think it goes. But they've never made a ventilator before. They've never really looked at making a ventilator before, whereas plenty of companies have. The difference is these companies have never had the money profile or, I'd imagine, desire to gain any real political capital at the state level. They've never donated to the Tory party. They've never attended the same parties and events with Boris, sniffed lines off the same toilet seats as him. They've never palled around with the establishment. They've never existed in these circles. And they've also never been seen as a figurehead of great British business, which is something that is once again being used as a political tool. You know, we've got to champion great British business. And what does everybody think of when they think of great British business? I'd imagine quite a lot of us do think of people like James Dyson. So already we see how the actual, like, what would be a good decision, as in ordering ventilators from people who already make them, is already not happening because of a profit motive, because of politics, because of disaster capitalist thinking. So yeah, James Dyson's done all them things. The ventilator contracts Dyson will be getting can be seen quite explicitly as a reward for his donations and loyalty to the Tory party. And in a lot of ways, it really is that simple. It really is just cronyism. There's a lot of, it's a weird one, disaster capitalism, because on the surface, it's actually quite simple, but there's a lot of, when you dig into it, there's a lot more behind it, which I'm going to try and do a little bit here. Yes, in a lot of ways, it also kind of isn't that simple. There will no doubt be some perfectly reasonable sounding explanation for why Dyson got them contracts. So perhaps, I don't know if this happened or not, but it's something that I could certainly imagine happening from knowing past examples. Perhaps Dyson might have said that if the government holds off, gives Dyson this big contract, supports their efforts with the promise of that contract, he can do a big bulk discount and make sure that the public purse isn't hurt as much, and that, you know, he can make it for cheaper, etc. Now, if we go for a second with capitalist technocratic logic, that would make total sense. And when I say that, I mean this kind of capitalist neoliberal desire to focus on numbers and statistics and models and data modeling and quantitative data and technical solutions over anything else. So it makes sense. A short wait for more ventilators when there are currently enough in the country so that we can get them for less out of the public purse makes complete sense, right? Well, you might have picked up on something in that sentence that didn't really make sense. I said there are enough ventilators. Are there enough ventilators? I don't exactly know where we're at today, but from what I've been hearing over the past few weeks, there are enough ventilators in the country to go around. There are enough in the UK for everyone to have one. The issue with ventilators is that they don't teleport. You might have plenty of ventilators in Aberdeen. Brilliant. You'll have loads of beds sitting empty in Aberdeen, maybe, but not enough in London. Now, there'll be some, that's really typical of technocratic disaster capitalist thinking. They'll see this statistic, X number of ventilators for Y number of people who need them in the UK, and see X greater than Y, wicked. They might even break it down to a county level, potentially, maybe even a devolved level. Who knows? So they think, wonderful, that's fine. But what this doesn't account for is that they're distributed over a really wide region and unlikely to be distributed such that every single ventilator is in the same rough area as every person who needs one. Right, that's just not going to happen. There'll be empty ventilators sat somewhere unused and people who need ventilators stuck without them hundreds of miles away. The only realistic way to tackle this is to have a massive surplus of ventilators, basically. Now, before we go on and kind of continue with the James Dyson story, I just want to talk a little bit more about technocracy and capitalism and disaster response and recovery, because it's one of the things that I think is really kind of overlooked as an issue with capitalism and disaster response. So it's really actually really key to capitalist thinking, and it's absolutely everywhere, this over-reliance on numbers. Again, has anybody got any examples of that? Can anybody think of any examples? There's one really big one which underpins capitalist thinking that you'll kick yourself if you don't get. Oh, you're a quiet bunch. Anyway, what I was thinking of actually was GDP being equivalent to well-being. How many times have you seen in the news the country's doing amazing, the GDP's gone up? I couldn't even properly define for you what GDP is. It's a very abstract economic concept that doesn't really have that much relation to the well-being of the people living in the country with that GDP. I've seen GDP rising year on year on year for a lot of my life, and I haven't actually seen that translate into living conditions going up. But as long as a capitalist technocrat can say, well, GDP is rising and that's how we measure how well we're doing, then there's no need to look at them granular things. There's no need to look at things like underfunding. There's no need to look at them deep societal issues which affect people. We can just look at number going up and take that as good, and we can all pat ourselves on the back and go home. We don't need to think about the things that we aren't looking at, if you know what I mean. There's a really good example of this, which is really harrowing apologies that we've seen in disaster capitalism as well. It's always stuck with me. It's something that I learned about a few years ago, and it's happened in Kenya. I was told about this by the head of operations for a really quite large NGO, and he was actually really quite ashamed of this when I spoke to him. And it happened in a place called Turkana in Kenya. Turkana suffers a lot of famine, a lot of drought, and it was in this case suffering from a big famine. This was a few years ago now. You might well have heard about it. Now, this NGO set up feeding centres all across Turkana, took the people coming in, and we're looking at numbers of global and severe acute malnutrition to see how well things were going. Now, what they were seeing was that people were coming in with quite high levels of global and severe acute malnutrition, coming in quite a bad way, but you weren't actually getting that many people dying. The fatality rate wasn't actually that high at the centres from what they could see and who they were seeing. So for head office, this looked like actually quite a good response. These feeding centres are doing their jobs. What the actual result of this is that they found out later on that families had been leaving anybody who wasn't likely to make the journey to the feeding centre at home to die, and just taking the ones who would make the journey. So all them people who were being left at home, mostly children who couldn't travel, were being left to die because they wouldn't survive the journey. They weren't getting included in them statistics, and it wasn't until later that we found that out. So that actually really hamstrung that response. And immediately when we stopped looking at just quantitative data of like GAM, SAM, mortality rate, things like that, what we actually see when we go to a more local qualitative level and actually really look at the reality is that that response has totally failed. And there were quite easy ways to make that not fail as well. They could have gone house to house instead of having big feeding centres, could have much more localised their response. But that didn't happen because of this reliance on quantitative data. Obviously that is really rough. I suspect personally that this is endemic to hierarchical systems as a whole, and not just capitalism. When major decisions are being made by people abstracted from real world situations, you need to create these abstractions for them to work with. Imagine how hard it is to describe in a very short report that is easily digestible to somebody at the top of the EU bureaucracy who hands out the funding for NGOs, how hard it is to describe that situation accurately in a report that they're actually going to read when you've got people working on the ground. Like, they are not going to have the time to go into the detail of that case, and it's obviously just not going to result in a good response. Now, that's not to say that data isn't useful, even vital, but it is just a descriptor of real world phenomena and gives you only a single brushstroke of a much, much bigger painting. It's why, if it happens, I'd be deeply, deeply surprised to find out that we at some point have more than enough ventilators, but lack of staff with sufficient expertise to operate them, and lack of medicines to work alongside them, the lack of the anesthesia that's needed, the lack of all the other little things that go along with a ventilator to make it work, because we've ended up focusing too heavily on the ventilator thing because that's the headline right now, and the government is very much enthralled to what the headline is. It's actually interesting that in the last few days we've had this thing about the care homes as well, and the care home figures not being included in death figures. Again, another example where we've got a headline figure that isn't taking into account the reality of the situation, and that is specifically being used for political ends. I don't genuinely believe in Kenya it was in a big way being used for political ends. I think in this case it very much is, because a high death toll on the front page, it doesn't look good for Boris Johnson and co. So after a little sort of foray into the problems of technocracy, let's just go back to James Dyson for a second and general profiteering from disaster relief. I want to come back to the Iraq War as the most egregious example of this. I mentioned war very briefly earlier. It's not necessarily something people think of with disaster capitalism, but the Iraq War is probably the largest disaster capitalist project that has ever happened. It is outrageous in its scale. It's an absolute scandal, and I know that we're all quite scandalized about the Iraq War here in the UK. We all hear the butcher of Baghdad, Tony Blair, but the scale of the economics involved is absolutely mind-blowing. It's actually almost impossible to estimate how much public money went to US companies for Iraq-related contracts, many of which never even end up being fulfilled, but it runs well into the hundreds of billions. You'll notice I said US companies there, because in Iraq, favor was always given to large US corporations over local businesses. Paying local people would inject cash into the Iraqi economy. It's economically the right thing to do. There is no real debate about whether you should pay local people in disaster situations to rebuild their own lands. It's why volunteerism is such a big issue. But that didn't happen. Likewise, with COVID-19, you've got big companies like Dyson getting a contract where small workshops who don't have that lobbying capacity in those relations to power don't. Anyway, back to Iraq. What's more, with such a confusing web of private interests at work and in such a fluid and difficult situation, it's actually estimated that around $60 billion of private contract money was lost to plain old corporate corruption. Now, that is not what we would consider corruption. That's not what I'm considering corruption or what you would most likely consider corruption. That's like what the US admits happened, that money just like got lost. $60 billion. And that's because it's quite easy to say that you built a bridge if nobody's going to go and check because they're worried about getting blown up if they do. And there's also no interest in them checking. They're all making money out of this. It's easy to pretend in a disaster, it's easy to cover up, and it's easy to shift blame. In these fast-moving situations, you've got proper accountability that gets put on hold. And we're seeing this in the UK right now, particularly with the police and increasingly with people's willingness to criticize the government as well, weirdly. I'll come a little bit more into the police a little bit later in the UK as well. I want to focus right now, just to stick with Iraq for a second, I really want to focus on one company, and it's called Halliburton. I imagine a few of you have probably heard of Halliburton before. It's a major contractor of kind of one of these companies that just takes government contracts. That's where it makes most of its money. Sort of like Serco, Capita we have here over here in the UK, like G4S is kind of, there's a bit of a similar thing. From defense to food provision, it's kind of got you covered on massive, large-scale government level contracts. It's conservatively estimated that just one of its subsidiaries responsible principally for reconstruction and energy was awarded $39.5 billion of contracts. Now, because the invisible hand of the free market obviously works super well, that's a really fair process to make sure that the best one for the job gets the contract, right? No, of course not. It was the only company allowed to bid for those contracts most of the time. So much for the invisible hand of the free market. A little pop quiz. If anybody knows the answer, genuinely, mad props, and please do throw your hand up. Who, until 2000, was the CEO and chairman of the board of Halliburton? Anybody know? Feel free to pop it in the chat. Anything in the chat? No. It was Dick Cheney, US vice president from 2000 till 2009, one of the US's biggest, most famous, and most disliked warmongers. Did he jump just from Halliburton into US government? No. He had been a US congressman and White House chief of staff previously to his time in Halliburton. So he actually went from US congressman, White House chief of staff, an extremely major and powerful position, right onto the head of the board of Halliburton and its CEO, so right out of public, right into private, and then amazingly right back into public again to award his old company, literally within a year of leaving it, billions and billions, hundreds of billions worth of contracts. Like, that is entirely legal. There is nothing in the capitalist system which says that that is wrong. How are we all feeling about this? I really would like to hear from some of you on like what that makes you feel about the system and how we're feeling. Chris, I'm just going to unmute you 2 seconds. Yeah, so I'm going to go. Oh, it's not letting me unmute you. There you
go. I just wanted to say, like, I think I've heard that about training, but I just wanted to say that sort of thought it was an interesting point, but sort of you hear some people on sort of maybe sort of the right, like so-called libertarians, talk about sort of being against sort of cronyism, but it just sort of drives home the idea that no, capitalism as it exists and always existed has been designed to work in a way that the state and capital work together and sort of synergize to create the system. It's not like they're opposed to each other in any way. It's like the quote sort of Karl Marx, the state is nothing more than a committee of the bourgeoisie. Sort of the state exists in a way that sort of worked with the, I thought that sort of drove home that idea quite well. I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, sorry, I'm just going to put you back on mute. Oh, yeah, cool. Yeah, Will, I've got a hand up from It's Will. Just going to unmute you.
Hello, yeah, I suppose in a way it's not surprising, but what it made me think of is, sorry, I get China and Japan modelled up, so hopefully no one from there is in this chat, but in Asian countries it's weird, they seem to have a form of capitalism that isn't destructive. in the same respect. I know it's controversial, but if you see where I'm coming from, because they have mass consumerism, it's not really the same as America. Like in America, you'll have someone in power who then becomes the head of a very capitalist company. But in an Asian country, they just expect to keep buying things. It's really weird, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say it's not as destructive. It's just, so I think you're probably referring to a lot of the Asian tiger countries that sort of really came up during the late 90s, well, whole of the 90s. And these companies that outwardly what they did was create a much more sort of like state-led capitalism and much more heavily regulated their markets as compared to the West's much more free market style, which does kind of cast them from a capitalist perspective as being the good guys in sort of free market neoliberalization. I would say that it is still very much equally as destructive though, and you get these countries that maybe start off that way. Capital interests eventually leach their way into government, and they will go the way of America. I'm almost certain. Naomi Klein does actually talk about this in the Shock Doctrine. I swear I'm not just plugging her book. It does actually have a lot of problems with it as well. And people are often quite critical of it, but it does mention stuff about the Asian tigers and kind of the difference in East Asian economies. Yeah, good point. Yeah, so I'm seeing in the chat here, we've got people saying they're absolutely livid, and absolutely you should be. We all should be, obviously. There's no other reasonable reaction to this. That's why you should join the Green Anti-Capitalist Front. So we've talked a little bit about kind of the direct profiteering from disasters that happens. The sort of obvious, like government giving contracts to private capital to give more public money to private capital. Yeah, it's essentially also the transfer of poor to rich as well, because that money is largely taxes. So taxes go to government, go to corporations in the form of bailouts and contracts. It's a cornerstone of neoliberal thinking. Neoliberalism, for anybody who doesn't know, being an extreme form of free market orthodox economics, pioneered by the likes of Milton Friedman and the Chicago School of Economics back in the 60s. A real interesting one to read about, because that like strain of thought is largely responsible for all of this. So disaster-wise, in terms of disasters, you've kind of got two types of disasters. You've got slow and rapid onset. Most people probably think of rapid onset. What we're seeing right now is a slow onset. So the response of authorities is obviously going to be really different for everyone. But what we'll always see in a state capitalist response is an increase of state power. This literally never doesn't happen. We've already seen that in the UK with the Police Emergency Powers Act. Whether you think that's sensible or not, there may well be people in this chat who think that it's perfectly sensible to give the police more powers. It is an increase in state power, undeniably, and it's something that I think even those people would very much agree we should always be wary of. I would hope there's nobody who would disagree with that. Often government regulations do seem genuinely sensible and smart until you look deeper into them, into the actual real world effects of them when you actually get on the ground. So as an example of government regulations often seeming sensible and smart and in the name of helping people and keeping everyone safe, I'm going to give you another example, and this is another one of my absolute favorites in the world of disaster capitalism. It's another real mainstay of our field. So I talked a little about the 2004 tsunami earlier. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. In the aftermath, many governments, including those of Thailand, Sri Lanka, India, the Maldives, and Indonesia, instituted safety reforms prohibiting the reconstruction of communities within given distances of the coast in given areas deemed to be high risk of tsunamis. So basically just moved these communities back. Now on the surface, that seems relatively sensible. If you don't want people to get hit by tsunamis, maybe don't put them in a place with a tsunami and maybe say that they should move. That seems openly sensible. The issue is the communities relied on fishing to survive. There were fishing communities, there were coastal communities, and what's more, they had for millennia previous to capitalism colonizing their areas, had been dealing with tsunamis. They knew how to deal with them. You get things built on stilts, you get things that are easily reconstructible. There are signs of a tsunami coming, which indigenous people can often recognize. It wasn't like they really needed a capitalist state's help. So you move a lot of coastal communities away from the coast and you destroy those communities. They annihilated entire communities, the very fabrics of their lives. Now, is this just governments being overzealous and just looking at safety in an effort to not lose more lives in the future and maybe just having a bit of a blind spot and making a mistake? No, it's not, basically. We know it's not just that, because within literally days of the tsunami striking, Returning villagers were often seeing wire fence and construction hoarding going up around their old communities. A Thai man told researchers, "I came to the village the day after the tsunami to look for my children, but the guards had already put a fence up. I begged them to let me in, but they said it was their land and they would be building a hotel. They held their guns and said that if I didn't go, I would join those who died." That is state capitalist power, and that is how state capitalist power treats people in the aftermath of disasters when it doesn't think it's going to be reprimanded for it and when it doesn't think anyone can hear, by the way. You're not really going to get that in the UK because we do ostensibly have a press and a voice, but you're going to get things done in ways that are a lot more mealy-mouthed and are a lot more kind of polite about it. Not, we're going to shoot you if you come back, but we just need to build this development. It's for the good of the economy. Why are you complaining? In many cases, hoteliers in these areas had been lobbying governments to forcibly evict communities so they could build hotels on the valuable coastal land for decades. In much of these cases, that was already the case. They were already the vultures were circling. So when the tsunami did that for them and evicted these communities, that they weren't just going to let that opportunity pass. Anybody who's been on a moderately spiky protest, demo, anything like that, will know that it's a hell of a lot easier to hold ground than it is to take it. If you can, it's really hard to push on something. If you're already there, it's quite easy to stay there. So under the guise of safety, just to recap, we have whole communities displaced permanently so that capitalist entities can move in and turn the land to a profit. In many cases where the communities had actually physically returned before the contractors got there, relief funds are actually withheld and were only paid out to those who agreed to give up the rights to their lands. Now, obviously, that again is just disgusting. Capitalism literally is colonialism. If anybody ever tries to separate them things for you, do mean things to them. Tell them they're fools, and then make them read more about disaster capitalism or join the Green Anti-Capitalist Front. You certainly don't need redcoats and muskets when you've got tsunamis and property law. So like I mentioned earlier, the other extremely extensive studied example of this was Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And yeah, definitely 100% recommend reading about that. That was ethnic cleansing. Black communities moved out, oftentimes literally shot by private security companies. There are cases of poor Black people in New Orleans being shot by private security companies who've been hired by the rich in New Orleans to protect their areas. That happened in the United States of America in 2004. First world, and industrialized Western nations are in nowhere necessarily immune to this, and it does happen within borders as well. Bringing it back to COVID-19 a little bit, it's really hard to predict what the long-term effects of this are going to be. The dynamics of this slow onset disaster are really different to the dynamics of any rapid onset disaster, and indeed any other disaster for generations. Some governments, like that of Hungarian fascist Viktor Orban, have already moved to grant themselves unlimited emergency powers. Hungary has gone from a democracy with a fascist in power to a fascist dictatorship, an explicitly fascist Nazi-style enabling act, full-on Reichstag fire fascist dictatorship overnight because of COVID-19. In the UK, we've seen the introduction of emergency powers for police officers, and we've already seen those getting misused. Now, I actually got stopped myself. I was literally sitting on a bench meters away from anybody, and police officers proceeded to come within about 1.5 meters, refused to step back, threatened force, and eventually did fuck off, thankfully. But yeah, it really is that easy. It could sort of be argued that these are really useful powers for the police to have and that they do actually need them. Obviously, it could be argued that. However, what we're actually seeing in the real world is more people being arrested, bringing people into close contact with more people than they ever would have been, and more people being engaged at close distance by police officers, as I was. I'm sure some of you have been as well. Now, this actually ironically makes the police one of the most effective vectors of this virus, as one of the only things moving between quarantining people. The police are almost certainly responsible for thousands and thousands of infections because of this legislation and because of how it's being enforced. And ultimately, because the reality of this situation wasn't looked at, what was seen is we're trying to enforce something difficult. What do you do as a state capitalist power when you want to enforce something that your population might not necessarily do? You give the police powers. It's out the playbook. You don't necessarily need to look at the nuance of it. That's just what you do. Now, again, it's that technocracy thing, obviously. If they're all awesome, if all police officers are amazing, which obviously is a complete oxymoron because all coppers are bastards, then giving them powers to ask people to act in obviously non-socially distancing ways would be great, but they aren't, and they apply those powers unevenly, break social distancing, fail to interpret regulations properly, and are generally heavy-handed with little appreciation of the spirit of the law. The other really good fun thing about these new powers is that they do have a time limit, thankfully. They do have a time limit, don't worry about that. Time limit's 2 fucking years, at least 2 years with grounds for extension as well, with the possibility of extension. Now, they reckon that it usually takes around a year to a year and a half to develop a vaccine for something like COVID-19. We ain't seeing them powers go away after COVID-19 goes. We're going to see some sort of weird bastardized version of them into law permanently. Some aspects of them will get rolled back, but the police are 100% using this as a power grab, and it's going to work. The state and the police are going to be able to do that. My notes have disappeared. Give me 2 seconds. Sorry. Don't know what's happened there. That's a really another great thing that's really good about disasters for the elite, and we mentioned this earlier. It's really good. It's like a really good way to shut people up, basically. How many people have you heard in the past 4 weeks or so saying don't politicize this? Have we heard a lot of people saying that? I would imagine so. It's an obviously ridiculous sentiment, and I think that every single thing is political, and I'm sure a lot of you do too. But even when you don't, it's absolutely mad to say that this of all situations isn't political. The fact that we're due to be the worst hit country in Europe because of political decisions, specifically because of how this was actioned by the government, is obviously political. But this is very much how disasters fit into the framework of capitalism. They're hazards. Capitalism essentially ignores the vulnerability, ignores the idea of resiliency and vulnerability, and uses the hazard. It says, it was a plain old disaster. What could we have done about it? We're not to be blamed. And a lot of the public do sadly go along with that. It works shockingly well. And that is why, if there's like one thing that I want you to take away from this talk, it's that disasters are political, and anybody who says otherwise is a fucking idiot and needs telling so very fucking strongly. Yeah, I think we, I'm guessing most of your leftists here as well, we need to be really, really strong on this and really bold in making sure that this remains as a political issue, because it is a political issue, and then they're going to get away with it otherwise. But that is decorum politics in action. If you politicize it, you'll be called crass, you'll be called vulgar, but you are correct, so keep on doing it. I think, kind of coming to the end of things, I want to look a little bit into the future. Now, this is a lot more based on just me and what I think. I'm guessing that you want to hear my opinions, though, since you've tuned into a live stream by GAF. What can we expect going forward? I have absolutely no idea. What I would urge is to keep an eye on the things we've been talking about here, and don't be surprised to see enormous financial aid packages coming from the likes of the World Bank, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, that is, and the EU bodies which award these things, with extremely harsh neoliberal conditions attached. Things like you will have to make your market more free, deregulate your economy, allow foreign direct investment in a much bigger way. I didn't really touch on it much in this talk, but that is another really big sort of way that disaster capitalism is used to be friendly towards capital generally, is that they'll say you can have all of this aid if you agree to institute XYZ reforms. Probably the most famous example of that recently is Greece, when the Troika imposed that sort of stimulus package on Greece with the conditions that they could only have that money if they essentially neoliberalized their economy. Yeah, that's probably the most famous example. I definitely read about it. Disaster capitalism, by the way, doesn't just happen in the case of traditional disasters. It also happens in the case of economic disasters like depressions. Also happens in the case of wars, as we've seen. So do keep an eye out for this sort of thing in the case of economic crises, which we are definitely going to be seeing post-COVID. Don't think that disaster capitalism stops being a thing once the physical element of the disaster is over. That's not how it works. So yeah, hopefully people will be able to recognize that a little bit better and kind of respond to it a bit more. Now, what can we actually do about it? It's really hard to say and can feel super intimidating, because this isn't some shadowy cabal that we're up against. This isn't some, I'm not going to go into some like new world order bullshit about crazy men pulling the strings behind the scenes. You don't need to do that, to be honest. It's all quite out in the open if you bother to look. It's not even just a set of organizations that we're talking about, though. It's not even just a set of states or treaties or anything like that. It's an idea that we're battling against here. And that's what makes it so difficult. Neoliberalism, capitalism, and all of the things that come along with that, like corporatism, individualism, atomization of society, etc., deregulation of financial markets, trust in the free hand of the free market, all of these vaguely related concepts which make up the kind of body of neoliberal thought have very much kind of got their claws into society, particularly in the English-speaking world, and particularly in Europe and the US. It's entirely my opinion, obviously, but I mean, I think most of you would agree. For me, how we actually deal with this, and I think a lot of people in GAF would agree with this, is that it kind of has two prongs in how we respond to this. It's that kind of dual power approach. We have to expose the lies that the neoliberal project is based on, while also hindering its ability to operate smoothly. So you kind of have to create and destroy at the same time, basically. So the mutual aid groups that have popped out all over the world, that a lot of you will probably have been involved in, are really good platforms for this, for kind of re-networking communities and creating something different and showing that, look, your system, your capitalist system is actually shit, and we've got something much more effective here. The risk with them is that they don't develop into sustainable long-term networks. But we're hoping against hope that they will. And honestly, that's not just a question of hoping. It relies on what every single person in this group call and our peers on the left now do, and how much we engage ourselves with these mutual networks and try and make sure they remain the radical political spaces that they were created as. You'll encounter a lot of people in those networks who are still very much on board with the neoliberal idea. They may try to depoliticize things. They may try to encourage closer working with councils, etc. Don't let that happen. Be bold and strong against that. You will catch shit for it, but I promise you it's worth it. And it's the only way that these mutual aid networks are going to end up being something useful in the long term. They are one of the greatest opportunities that we have as anti-capitalists, and it would be a massive shame not to make sure that they stay incredible. Mutual aid is political, all aid is political, this entire disaster is political, and we shouldn't let anybody forget that. That's pretty much all I've got to say on it, really. Capitalism is collapsing, and what it collapses into is up to the work of people like ourselves and our peers. You don't need your masters, you don't need anyone to tell you what to do, you don't need an authority to do that, you've never needed that, and you never will, we never will. Just believe in that and go forward with that in your head, and hopefully we'll do all right out of it. Now that's me done. What we're going to do now is have a little bit of a discussion / question and answer. To be honest, I only recently really heavily read up on disaster capitalism again, so there's probably going to be things that I won't know that you'll ask me. That's fine. I can probably direct you to someone who might. And just kind of share your thoughts and share how you're feeling about this, and any ways that people might want to get involved. Go ahead. The floor's open.
Yeah, hello?
Yeah, go for it, Will. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you... I know you mentioned power earlier. I don't know... I can't remember if it was an episode of The Grand Tour or Top Gear, but I don't know if you saw it when they went to Russia. They met a farmer, speaking of power, who every morning this fence would be moved forward. So every morning his back garden would either be in Russia or Ukraine. And it's a great analogy because every now and then he wouldn't be able to visit certain parts of his farm. And I think it's a great way of analogy for explaining how much capitalist power the government actually has.
Yeah, it's that sort of, I kind of always like to think of it as kind of like an ocean a little bit, and you get sort of swept along by this ocean, whether you like it or not. Like the people who had their coastal communities moved, they had been living fine like that for millennia, and then capitalism comes along, turns their whole way of life upside down with the promise of something better, and then rips it away at the first opportunity when it turns out not to be all that profitable in the end. That's a real fun example of it. Has anybody got any other things there? Angus.
Yes, I'm not going to take the opportunity to Stalinistically give you back your prepared questions or answers. Instead, I'm going to rely something I read on the chat that I thought was pretty interesting. Someone talking about the mutual aid groups said that many of them, or they are not really mutual or based on solidarity yet, at least not completely, and that in itself may be a vulnerability of disaster capitalism. One of the that the culture, I imagine that the culture or the characteristics of a place like Britain makes it really hard to actually develop really mutual networks. So yeah, I thought that was an interesting point. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I entirely agree. Basically, I wouldn't say they are exactly operating as mutual aid so much as like shopping delivery services, but hopefully, hopefully that will change, and hopefully that will get better over time. I've definitely had experiences where you've got like Labour Party politicos, you've got council people, you've got like former councillors, Labour Party activists, branch secretaries of CLPs, constituent Labour parties, getting in mutual aid groups and like immediately just like bureaucratizing them. I actually left one of the groups because they had, I'm not kidding, they talked about nothing but GDPR for an entire week and how they could be GDPR compliant. And it's just like, man, you're really fucking trying to fit in the capitalist framework when this is an explicitly anti-capitalist network that you try and like literally fuck off. But yeah, I don't think they're particularly operating as a mutual aid network should yet, but I think they're the closest thing we've got right now, and we should nurture them and put everything into trying to make them work that we can, and introduce more radical concepts like rent strikes and that sort of thing as we go on. Has anybody got anything else they kind of want to say on the topic before I talk a little bit about kind of GAF and kind of slightly more concrete ways to get involved and move forward? Not seeing any hands. Cool. Yeah. So okay, just to finish off. Oh, we've got something in the chat. What we got there? I'm down for playing some music to send us out. If anybody's got any favorites, go for it. But yeah, just to talk a little bit about GAF and kind of how we relate to all this. GAF is the Green Anti-Capitalist Front. It was established kind of just over a year ago by a group called the Anarchist Federation. It's not a group as such, it's a front. So if you want to do something under the GAF banner, as long as it sticks to our aims and principles, which you can find on the website, then you can call yourself GAF. Anybody can be GAF. We are all GAF. If we're doing green anti-capitalist things and choose to be GAF, we are GAF. In terms of how to get involved with the biggest group of GAF people in London right now, or anywhere actually, I would say just message your local GAF group's Facebook page. It's probably the best way to do it. Or pop them an email as well. You can find emails and contacts for all of them on the website. And we're all about sort of trying to build that dual power of one, carrying out mutual aid and building an alternative society within the old one, but also utterly smashing the current one at the same time. I think we're a really good fun group to be involved with, and you should all do it. That's me out, unless anybody else has anything else. Oh, reading group. Yeah, that's it. Thanks, P. Yeah, so we also have a reading group. Could somebody tell me when that is from GAF, please? Put in the chat. Got a reading group on disaster capitalism.
Yes, I have it in front of me.
You do, brilliant.
Is the 23rd of April. I will share the link on the chat as well. And also, we should talk about the May Day Revolt.
Yes. Oh, let's absolutely talk about that as well. Yeah. So the GAF reading group, as we just heard there, is on the 23rd. There'll be details going up, and we have an event. If you go on the GAF Facebook page, you'll find the event there as well. Oh, actually, yeah. Do you want to speak, P? Yeah, you can talk about this. Go for it.
Yes. So the GAF reading group. Can you hear me? Cool. We want to do a series of meetings. So every meeting will have a different theme. So you can pop in and pop out as according to whether you're interested or not in the theme, even though it would be great if you come to all of them. And it's more like a discussion. So we won't be going over a book and reading it page by page. We will actually be offering a series of texts based on the theme that we've chosen, and you can read as many of them as you want, or none of them if you don't want to. and we will have a discussion on a theme. We also post some questions to give you an idea of what the discussion will be around if you want to prepare in advance. And we just aim to have it as open and as accessible as possible. And the first one, which is on Thursday, the 23rd, we will continue on the theme of disaster capitalism. So we have some readings and some questions, and we want to lead off this discussion and have a bigger one. But we will be posting other readings and dates when we prepare them for future events.
Cool, and we'll also be we're hoping to do these live streams as a series as well, hopefully. We've got one sometime in the next month. I'm not sure what that one's on, but I'm sure it'll be awesome. And finally, the last thing that I really wanted to mention was May Day. Obviously, for those who don't know, May Day is a really big day for kind of activism and leftism and unions and such. And obviously, we're not going to be able to celebrate May Day in the usual way we would because of COVID-19. However, the Green Anti-Capitalist Front would really like if you would participate in the May Day Revolt. So we're encouraging people to take on autonomous direct action. Do it on your own, do it in a small crew, preferably maintaining social distancing still. You could do all sorts of things. There are examples on our poster, which you'll find on our website. Anything that hurts capital and helps people, or either one of those does it. I would never suggest doing anything outside of the bounds of the laws set for us by our great state. But if you feel like being a little bit naughty, now's the time. And that's pretty much it.
Yeah, I think that's all for it.
Cool.
Do you want to see us out yourself?
No, just thanks for coming, guys. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've kind of learned something. I hope that you'll come to the reading group as well to discuss a little bit more too, a bit more of an open discussion. I'll hang around here until kind of everyone's left. If anybody does want to kind of chat about anything we've been going through in less of a big group setting, I'll just hang out here. Otherwise, much love and solidarity always.
See you all soon.